Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where friends help each other make sense of the world as they follow Jesus together. And my dear friend, Nancy French, joins me today to talk about her new memoir, Ghosted. But before we get to Nancy, I want to remind everyone to stick around to the end of the episode when I will read a listener review. And if you want to hear your review read on the episode of Good Faith, just rate and review us where you get your podcasts. So Nancy, welcome back. I think is this your third time, fourth time? Do we have to get a jacket for you now as a 4 or 5 timer Good Faith
I
podcast?
need a jacket. I'd rather have a sash or something.
I don't think I've got a sash for you.
A
Um,
crown.
well, listeners will know that Nancy and I are longtime friends and collaborators. Nancy was a really helpful initial editor for me on the Anxiety Opportunity book. She's been a voice and a presence on the After Party video curriculum. And then she's a co-author with me on the After Party book that is out now that helps Christians move towards better Christian politics. And while she's doing all that, she's also an investigative journalist, breaking the news of sex abuse at America's largest Christian camp. And amidst all of that, she has written her own book called Ghosted, an American story. It's her memoir, and that's what she's here to talk to us about. Now, Nancy, you and I've never actually talked to you after I've read the book. Listeners are going to hear live my first time talking with you about my experience reading your book. So we're kind of being vulnerable here live.
I'm excited. You know, Curtis, I went to your house a couple of years ago and we had this late night conversation, you and your wife Jody and my husband David, and we were talking about my childhood. Do you remember that night?
I do remember that we were outside around the campfire, around our
Yeah,
backyard campfire.
an actual campfire. He practices what he preaches. But yes, and I remember that night because your response to my descriptions of my childhood was shock and awe. And so I was like, oh, you know what? This might be a good story because I'm a professional storyteller and I never really told all this.
Well, let's get into it. But first, I want to describe to you my reaction. So I get your book, and this is just a couple weeks ago, getting ready for this recording. And we're on a trip to LA, and I've got a kind of a busy life right now, Nancy. So I've carefully blocked out the weekend, this trip down to LA to see our daughter, that I'm going to read your book on the plane and in the hotel room and so forth. My life has got to get scripted down to the hour in this way these days. Jody, my wife, a good friend of yours as well, grabs the book from me and she just starts reading. And she will not put it down. Like we're like
Oh,
arguing, like, well, I need to read the book. She will not put the book down. She's reading it, and she just is like giggling, laughing, sighing as she reads it. And it's a page turner. And when I finally get the book back, wrestle the book back from her after she's done, I realize why she had that reaction. Nancy, you have written a really amazing book. It is a page turner, truly. It is poignant. I cried or misted up at least numerous times. And it has some powerful insights. And I want to talk about why this book is filled with powerful insights that everyone should read. The way I would put it is this, Nancy, is I had Tim Alberta on the podcast talk about his book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. And I told Tim that he had written the book in terms of making sense of American Christianity in the last 20 years. But his book is a book of reporting. And I was like, your book is the like nonfiction historical account that everyone needs to read to make sense of what's happened in American Christianity the last 20 years. Nancy, I believe Ghosted is the memoir version of that. That Ghosted is going to be the definitive book to make sense of what's happened, because you can't make sense of really what's happening in America if you can't make sense of what's happened to American evangelical Christianity. And you can't make sense of American evangelicalism if you can't make sense of Southern Christianity. And I don't think you can make sense of Southern evangelical Christianity if you don't make sense of the kind of experiences that Nancy writes about in her story. So above all else, Nancy, you've written a gift, a definitive contribution to how Americans need to make sense of it. And I just think everybody that wants to understand the American story, which is the subtitle of your book, needs to run out, go and read Ghosted, and it'll only take you a day or two because you too won't be able to put it down. So Nancy, congratulations. I'm so proud of you. And I'm really like kind of tickled that I had some small role in catalyzing this amazing contribution.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so excited that you read it. This is, the book's not out yet. It's coming out very soon. Probably shouldn't say that. You might want to strike it. I don't know when this airs. But this is the first, it's very exciting and gratifying to actually talk to people who've read it. So this is very exciting for me. So thank you so much.
All right, Nancy, let's get into the book. You start the book by describing that you are a ghostwriter, and that, of course, is evoked in the title of your book, Ghosted. And a ghostwriter is someone who professionally tells the stories of other people, celebrities, especially in your case. You've written several New York Times bestseller books, which you've ghostwritten. Um, Tell us what prompted you to come out of the shadows and tell your own story. What prompted that, other than that after that evening conversation with us? What did that set in motion?
Well, I think I've done a lot of emotional healing over the past few years, and I realized that I was ghosting, at least partially, to hide behind other people's stories. So
Mm.
now, as I approach 50 years old, I felt like it was the right time to start telling my own story.
Well, you and I have talked about the process of ghostwriting for you, that you view it and experience it as a ministry almost, of helping other people make sense of their own lives, their own story. We actually did a podcast in the past about how storytelling is such a crucial part of how we make sense of the world and our own worlds as well. And when you're working with celebrities, it sounds like you're doing that work of helping them realize, oh my gosh, my story makes sense in a way that I didn't realize before. Did you have that similar experience for yourself in terms of making sense of your own life?
I think so. It was a lot harder than I thought it would be, Curtis. Working with me, I'm always like, this is no big deal. We can get this done. Give me a week. But with my book, it took me forever. I just labored over it. I couldn't decide what to include when I was doing hard parts. I didn't know how much to share so that it's not too hard, but it's, okay for the readers to digest. And so it was a quagmire. I felt like it was very difficult. I just struggled over every word. But yeah, it was helpful for me to do it. I was very thankful. And it was good to put everything on paper and to talk to the people who were involved in the stories, because I felt like that was something I hadn't quite done. I'd done my own healing, but I hadn't reached out to people who were in the stories. So it was all a very healing process.
Well, what would be an example of something that you realize that at the end of the book, after you've written, you realize, wow, I realized this anew about my life that I didn't realize before? What would be an example of that kind of realization?
Well, I talked to a bunch of my family members on the mountain, on Montego Mountain, which is, in Tennessee. And I just learned a bunch about my family during that process and got to know a lot of my family members better. And it was just in time because my cousin, who's in the book, he helped me a great deal. And then he died since, in the past couple of months. And I was very thankful that I had the opportunity to reach out to him and sort of reconnect.
Well, part of that telling of the story of the family is this secret that's been in your family. Actually, a number of shocking secrets that you uncover for the reader. One of them is a really, of course, the harrowing and painful telling of your own experience of sex abuse in the church, in a really, gripping, but also in some ways a terrifying story. It is a ghost story in that I felt scared reading it. And the book is your bringing that out of the shadows, bring that story out of the shadows. What has been the response to you as you've brought that story even more fully? I know it's been a process of years you've been doing that, but this book really seems to culminate the coming out of the shadows of this story of sex abuse. What's been the response to that?
Well, originally in 2016, when I wrote a Washington Post article about it, that was the first time I'd ever talked about it publicly. And this is the second, really. The only times I've talked about my own abuse are in the context of my investigative work where I'm helping other abused people. But this is the first time I'm sort of telling the story completely. So it'll be interesting to see how people respond to the story when the book is out. But already, as I'm talking about it more, I even have family members who had no idea, so they're contacting me and expressing their sympathies and kindness. So I think it's generally good. We'll see what happens when it hits the larger population.
Why is it important to talk about this? Why is it important to bring this to the light? What insights have you gained from this process?
Well, I think in terms of the abuse, it's important to talk about it because I don't think people understand how abuse is covered up institutionally over and over and over and over. I just don't think people get it. So they think, well, if you were abused as a kid, why didn't you tell someone? Or if you were abused as a kid, why is the guy still out there? And it's a confounding question. It's a very salient question. And so my story shows the layers of failure that have to exist in order for a kid to be abused. In the Spotlight movie, there was a great quote where it said, "If it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to abuse a child." And
Mm.
my story sort of epitomizes that.
Yeah, and it takes a village to hide and cover up the abuse of that story. Tell more about the layers of especially the cover up that you've had to penetrate in your own story of having bringing that to light, and in the other stories that you've been investigating.
Yeah. So in my story, I was abused by a vacation Bible school's teacher in a rural Tennessee church. And then I was told through shenanigans that he was eventually arrested for raping my friend's mom. Decades later, I was told while I was investigating Kanakuk Camp's sexual abuse, someone contacted me and told me that my abuser um, was a basketball coach in a nearby state at a public school. And I thought, how could that be if he was actually arrested for rape? That doesn't make sense. So I looked into it. He was never arrested. And when I called my friend whose mom this guy supposedly tried to rape, he was like, "Yeah, that all happened, but someone from your church came out to fix it." And I thought, not my church. My church is filled with salt of the earth, wonderful Christian people. I can't believe that. You mean the people who taught me about God actually hid a rape allegation? So was incredulous about that. So I actually called my hometown pastor and asked him, I said, I was just on the phone with my friend Jason, and he told me that you came to his house and tried to get him not to call the police. Is that true? And he was like, "Yep, it's true. You got me. That was
Wow.
me." And he also revealed that 15 other people were abused, and he knew about it, and he knew about my abuse. And it's like, oh, so it's so embarrassing to think about going to church 3 times a week and all of the adults in the congregation know what's going on with you, and then they're insidiously talking to you about sexual purity on Wednesday night and Sunday morning with your youth group. It is reprehensible. It is so upsetting. And so I had a very emotional conversation with my hometown pastor. But this is the same playbook that exists whenever abuse happens and institutions want to protect themselves. Curtis, when I've talked to you about it, I call it the satanic playbook,
Yeah.
which is people say, "Oh, well, this institution is too important to actually deal with this," or "this abuser is too effective," or "everyone loves this magnanimous predator. Surely this
Yeah.
isn't true." So I was just up against the same stuff that I was up against when I did any other investigative work, but this time it was me, and it was more personal, and I was more emotional, and I got slighted and shoved aside. And when I went to the high school to talk to them about it, they just ignored me, humiliated me. But eventually, because now I know how to present evidence, I was able to get his teaching license revoked. But it is a shallow victory because he's still out there. And I know, and because of my investigative work, I know where like dozens of predators are. I know their names, I know their addresses, I know their victims' names, and it's too late. Statute of limitations or institutional apathy just prevents any of it from getting solved.
Well, Nancy, your story, like I said, it's a horror story at one level. Um, and we'll get to the ways in which it's also at the same time a story of comedy, of redemption, of hope, a romance story. There's a lot to it, but I want to stay on the horror part of this story just for one more beat. How pervasive do you think this is in the American church? Because I think people will be tempted to read your story and think, "Wow, Nancy has an amazing and a horrifying and remarkable and all this." Think of this story as an outlier versus actually as a paradigmatic example. So, talk to our listeners about when they read this story, how much should they be alerted to the possibility, maybe even likelihood, that this is happening somewhere in their own world as well?
Yeah, I don't actually know the statistics on church abuse, But I do know that church members are very eager to overlook it in their own communities.
Yeah.
Um, when I'm so surrounded by the activist and victim communities right now because of my investigative work, I just hear about abuse constantly, like every day, all day. So I might not have a good perspective on it, but it seems so rampant. And what I've noticed is that church members will very easily draw the conclusion that the Catholics have a sex abuse problem, but not them, or Bill Clinton, or Harvey Weinstein, Hollywood, politics, but not my church or not my camp. And it's just not true. You have to sort of get your mind in the position of thinking, okay, abuse happens. My responsibility is to respond well to it. So that's the only thing. So, churches that teach over and over the depravity of man, for some reason, when it comes to their own members or leaders abusing people, they sort of shirk that, they toss that theology, and they're like, oh, no, 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 that could never happen here. So the
Yeah.
depravity of man, sort of ends when it sort of starts threatening their effective leadership.
Totally. Well, and you describe in your book just the depths that you sunk to because of that response, depression, spiritual darkness, even the temptation to commit suicide that you write about really vulnerably in the book. Then there's this miraculous turn where you are rescued from that state. Describe how that happened and who was involved in that.
So I was completely sad. I had my friend who died. I was struggling with suicide, and then I met a guy, and his name was David, and we started dating. And when I say started dating, it's we started and we stopped because it was like a 2 second dating experience before we were married. But during those 2 seconds, David told me about Jesus and the Holy Spirit, and the way that he presented it to me for the first time in my life, I believed. In my entire life, I'd gone to church 3 times a week, but I felt like I was going into a movie theater like 10 minutes before the end, where you don't exactly know who the major players are or what's going on. But David presented it to me in a way that I could understand. And when he told me about the Holy Spirit, I was like, oh my gosh, I would love to have the Holy Spirit, because I understood the dark spiritual powers, but I didn't
Yeah.
understand that. And so I was all about that. So I went from sort of a college black fingernail, wearing clove cigarette smoking person into a Christian. So I was, and at the time I was maybe, sporting my atheism on my sleeve, but then I believed, and I've believed ever since.
Well, and it's a beautiful story of it's a romance story, really. Then the horror story becomes a romance story, sort of a third of the way or a quarter of the way into the book. And it also becomes a comedy because we get to see David French romantic, where he proposes to you by a sewage pipe. I believe is the was the context
Yeah,
of
why
that
would he
romantic
do that?
proposal.
Yeah, he had no ring. I
Yeah,
didn't
no.
even know if he was like serious, but I could tell by his face that he was serious, but I wasn't even really listening to him because he was waxing eloquent about love, and I was walking by a sewage pipe and I was thinking, why did we stop at a sewage pipe? This is weird. And then suddenly he was proposing and I was like, yeah, I'll marry you. Why not?
I encourage readers to check out the story because that turn from the horror story to the romance comedy story is hilarious, and there are just other really funny laugh out loud incidents of their early marriage. So and I want to talk about this because about this juxtaposition of the horror story with the romance slash comedy story, because it gets to this dynamic of gender in America and American Christianity, American Southern Christianity, where in the darkness there's so much horror that is happening in abuse, primarily committed by men against vulnerable women. And so that's the horror. And yet you tell that story, and yet you can also tell the romance and the comedy part of the story, where it is also men and women being able to rescue each other, being able to call each other into the light, and David calling you to Jesus, but also I know your marriage enough to know how much you have called him to hope, to humor, to endurance, that he couldn't do anything of what he's doing now without you. how tell us how you've been able to hold those two together, because somebody like you who had this the horror part of the experience could easily just like write off men, at least southern men. You would be completely validated based on what you read in the story to do that, and yet you have this other part of the story that is the comedy romance, so the rom-com part of the story. How do you hold both of these together, Nance?
I think when I was abused, my romantic dial was sort of turned to the wrong level or something, and I dated so many people, wonderful people, but not right for me. And I was just had a lot of false starts. And so when I met David, I don't think it was any sort of like machination intellectually on my own part. I think that the Holy Spirit just draws you. And I just felt my heart leap, not romantically, but spiritually. I could sense God. Um,
Nancy, the other thing that's really kind of remarkable about your story is it is also a story of family, and the kind of legacies we have from family, the tangled legacies, the stories that we keep buried in the attic, in your case literally embodied by a KKK robe that's kept in a cardboard box in the attic, I believe. That's about the legacy of your family. And then how do you deal with that legacy? How do you bring into the light? How do you talk to your family members about what's true? And I want you to talk more about that process of bringing all of that painful stuff into your family relationships, because I think, again, this is an American story, and so many Americans right now are struggling with their families, a lot because of politics, because of attitudes on race, other divisions that are just really painful right now, and people don't know how to talk about it. They it's been kept in the attic, it's been kept suppressed, and yet it's brewing and bubbling, and and people still don't know how to do it. Your book is really a story about you bring so much that has been kept in the dark in your family legacy, and in some really amazing ways bringing it out into the light in your family relationships. What draw from that your process, and what advice would you give to people who are struggling with this kind of like, what do I do with this issue, this problem, this kind of these dark realities that's in my own family relationships?
Well, first, I love my family. I love all of my family, and I appreciate all the help that they gave, their blessing for this book. We did have a KKK robe in our house. It was not something that we talked about. We were sort of forbidden to talk about it. And so at this age, talking about it felt sort of disrespectful to my family. But I feel like the race issue culturally is so important that I needed to sort of just talk about it. And and is to sort of describe people who grew up in a different place. Like Curtis, if you met my family, I doubt you'd even be able to understand some of them in terms of their
Yeah.
accents and stuff like that. So I feel like I have a very unique position where I'm straddling both worlds, where I have this insight into my family of origin and the people on the mountain, the hillbillies, and but I also have the ability to communicate to the wider world about these issues. And so I think racism is a big issue. And so the way that I was brought up, we had this closet, and we knew that it was this robe in the closet. We knew it was shameful, but like what's more shameful is more commonly our actual beliefs that we hold. And so in my life, I've had to sort of dismantle some beliefs that I had. And normal is just what you grow up in, right? So you just perceive the world in a certain way. And so as I grew, I realized that this wasn't right. It never felt right. And later we adopted a child from Ethiopia, and so that was an interesting decision. And so but my family has welcomed her and embraced her so much. I do not have anyone in my family right now, like I'm not putting my kid in danger and putting her near KKK members. My family's participation in that was mostly historic. And so, they were keeping the robe so that they could maybe donate to a museum or something. But shockingly, museums have enough KKK robes that they didn't need ours.
Oh man.
So yeah, it's just weird. And I didn't necessarily want to talk about that because I thought that in the book, because I thought that it would be it just beyond the line of social propriety and that people would write me off. But I don't know. I just am getting old enough where I just feel like we should be honest and gracious to each other. And this my normal that I grew up in, as the family of hillbilly parents.
Well, how did your parents respond when you told them that you were going to tell this story of this reality that you had family members who were KKK members? What was that like?
I was apprehensive at first. I think people sort of wait to write their memoirs until their parents are dead. And I love my parents. I'm so thankful that they're still kicking. But I was apprehensive to tell them about it because I love them so much and I didn't want them to feel disrespected. I wanted them to feel honored. So I went to their house and I had not even told my parents that I was writing a book, and my publisher was already announcing that I had written a book. So I drove over there and told them, and I said, I'm not asking for your permission. I'm asking for your blessing. And it was one of those moments. My parents are in their 80s. It was the most sacred 2-3 hours of my life. They responded well. They understood. They disagreed with some of the stuff that I was going to put in there. But they gave me their blessing anyway. And my dad, even in that process, shared with me some stories that gave me better insight into why he acted in the way he did. And most touchingly, after we had this very difficult conversation, Daddy pulled me aside and he said, a year ago, I heard a sermon about being a better father. And for the past year, I've prayed every night that I'd be a better father to you. So this is an octogenarian. And I was so
Wow.
touched by that because I gave him the opportunity to help me, and he did. And I think sometimes we try to protect our family members by not having difficult conversations. And in a way, especially if these people are older, it makes sense because you just don't want to upset them or you don't want to ruin your relationship toward the end of their lives. But it's very important not to infantilize your parents,
Mm.
and to treat them like people, because one of the things about being human is having conflict, doing difficult things together, talking it out. And so I felt like it was just very sacred that I was able to talk to them in this meaningful way and that they were able to actually give me their blessing.
Wow. Well, Nancy, I remember you driving home from that very conversation and calling me up, and we talked and processed that very interaction. And I hung up with you, and I don't know if I shared with you how much that conversation has stayed with me in thinking about fathers and daughters. I'm a father, I have a daughter. And it struck me that fathers, let's just stay with fathers for a moment, we're human fallible creatures. We are going to fail our children. We're going to fail our daughters. Let's to be more specific. I failed my daughters in some hard ways to acknowledge. And one of the hard things is that from in many cases, as a father, you think the only thing you can do is feel sorry about your past failures, and in many cases all that's can be only an internal reality. You're blessed if you can even be able to articulate that in a conversation with your daughter. Many fathers never even arrive at that stage, but then to get to the stage where you can actually do something, not to erase your failures, but to actually acknowledge them and to communicate in some way that you're trying to make amends, which is not making it all okay. It's not excusing it, but it is to acknowledge and to say, I need to do something to acknowledge my failure and try to make it right before I die. It struck me that your father having this opportunity to bless your book was a very powerful opportunity for him to make amends, to actually give his blessing to that. And you gave him a tremendous gift in his 80s to give him before he died an opportunity to make amends. And I just thought that was really powerful. And that it struck me that there are more opportunities for that kind of redemption than we imagine if we are willing to attend to the Holy Spirit, perhaps as the children, as the daughters, or as the sons, for invitations to actually prompt that in your relationship with your parents. So, given that you did that and you had this experience of really, to me, amazing redemption, what advice would you give to people, to sons and daughters out there wanting to have that kind of redemptive, at least opportunity? What kind of advice would you give them?
Well, to all the victims out there, first of all, it's not your problem slash the onus is not on you to make that relationship right. So you've been through a
Mm.
lot. you're carrying a heavy burden. Like I was abused when I was 12. I'm 49, and I had the conversation with my dad when I was 49, and my mom, and they were both great. So, I don't really know, because a lot of these parents are not safe. And a
Mm,
lot of these adults are not safe. So I'm not exactly sure what to say to that, because there's not a one size fits all thing.
mm,
I had focused on my own healing enough for so many years that I felt like even if I walked in there and they completely rejected me, I think I would be able to handle that. So I waited until I was older, although I probably wouldn't have, would have been decimated emotionally, actually. But I waited until I was older, until I had enough emotional healing before I tried to rectify that. Um, so I'm not exactly sure. I think that, but because I deal mostly with pedophilia in my investigative work and in my own life, where that I was a victim of that. So with that, it's so uniquely insidious. It takes decades sometimes to untangle all of that. So I would just be sensitive to your own healing and to the opportunities that present themselves. I swear, Curtis, if I had not written this book, I'd never would have had this conversation with my parents. I wouldn't have sought them
mm.
out just to talk to them about it, because it would have been too painful. But necessity required that I have a conversation with them before they show up, at a bookstore and see their names in print. So anyway, so I was forced into it, and I'm so thankful that I did it. But I think proper caution emotionally is appropriate
Yeah.
for this.
Well, I want to emphasize to everyone again just that to be aware that this is an American story, that all the statistics, all the reporting shows that we are living in a culture and in a church that for decades have tolerated this kind of abuse and kept it in the darkness, and it's emerging now, and it's a painful process. And so, as Christians, this is the American church, we need to attend very carefully to how we respond, not just individually, but also as members of institutions. If this is coming up in your own church, please educate yourself on how you can be a helpful participant in your own church process. And we'll put some links in the show notes for what you can do, because this truly is an American story. Nancy, we talked about this this recognition and this acknowledgement and confrontation that you did with the legacy of racism in your own family story, embodied by the presence of a KKK robe in a cardboard box held in the attic. Um, you also write about your adoption journey and how you and David, as two white Southerners, adopted a black child from Ethiopia, as this interracial adoption. What has being this experience of being white parents of a black daughter, what has that taught you and David about race today in the country?
When we adopted, we just went for the fastest route. At the time, it was Ethiopia. And we read books about race and adoption and attachment and all that, but we were not fully prepared for what awaited us. When we brought our sweet Naomi home, we did not know that the culture was going to shift so radically and become radicalized on this issue of race. The culture has been torn apart. We also did not realize that David would be, at the tip of the spear in terms of cultural pundits. So we were sort of in the spotlight with a child that we had adopted interracially, transracially. So we were a family of, immigrant. We had an immigrant family, at least with Naomi. And so people just attacked us horribly. What I realized from that was my own feelings about racism were not complicated enough. They were not robust enough.
Mm,
Previously, I thought, well, we can love a child no matter the color. It's no big deal. Love is love. Love conquers all, which is true. However, there are inherent problems when you have a transracial family, because I had to be on a learning curve on what it's like to be black in America, and I'm not black in America.
mm,
So I started learning that. So like previously I thought, well, racism, it's not something that I see very much. I'm a middle class person. I live in Franklin, Tennessee. So you don't feel like you see it very much. But then when I got Naomi, I saw it everywhere. And I was like, well, how do you explain that? Right. So like I'd be at Nordstrom's, and policemen would, talk to Naomi, suspecting that she was stealing stuff, or people would follow us in higher end stores to see if we were stealing. And I've never been followed before in my life. And so this is what I realized, that let's say that if you're in middle class white America, it is not socially appropriate usually to be a racist. And so everybody hides it, right? So people hide it. You're around people. Not everybody is a racist, but the people who are racist hide it, I should say. So let's say conservatively that 1 out of 100 people are racist. If you're a white housewife in Franklin, Tennessee, you will never see that because it's not socially appropriate. But if you're black and 1 out of every 100 people are racist, you see that a lot because you encounter a lot of different people. And so I just started asking questions and talking to people that I knew who were African American and asked them to tell me their stories. And suddenly my eyes were opened. Not only did I see racism targeted, at Naomi, but I saw it in my friends, and I sort of had to repent of my lack of understanding of that, my lack of knowledge, and sort of expand that so that I could understand my daughter more and my nation more, honestly.
And again, this is why I keep saying this story is an American story, because it's a story of abuse, of faith, of race. I mean, it's got all of the core themes that define the American story today, covered in your book per se. But I know that you're going to a predominantly African American church right now. What is that like? And I mean, to go from where you started as a white conservative Christian in a Church of Christ church on the mountain to a predominantly African American church. What does that say about all of this, about the journey that you're on right now?
Well, we'd been going to a PCA church here in Franklin, and we kept getting confronted by people who were angry at us for various political positions. And when a neo Confederate confronted us at church, I just decided I'm never coming back here again. And the African American church that we go to is called Strong Tower. And I know it's not perfect, but as I told my husband, at least it's not full of neo Confederates. I can guarantee you that. So we started going to this church, and it was David and me and Naomi at the time. We have other kids that come in and out. But when we visited and they asked you to raise your hand so you could get the little mug, and the little cookies or whatever, we raised our hands as visitors, and they gave David and me the little bags. But then they looked at Naomi and they said, "You belong here, don't you?"
Mm,
And it was very touching because in my life, I'd always drug Naomi to all of the things that we did, and she was always the odd man out. And in this case, we're the odd man out, but we're not really, because in the body of Christ, ethnicity should not be something that divides us. And so we've really enjoyed it. We love our church, we love our pastor, and they've embraced us during this time, and it's exactly where we're supposed to be.
well, let's talk more about this faith journey that you've been on. Ghost is a story of faith. You end the book really on a note about your encounter with God. Describe for us like this journey. Like, you certainly came to faith and an experience with the Holy Spirit, like I said, in that romantic part of that story with David. How has this story, the faith part of the story, continued to play out in recent years for you, Nancy?
Well, my life is crazy. I feel like I should be 85 years old with all of the stories that are in this book, and so many hit the cutting room floor. It's crazy. So I grew up rural Tennessee, shooting guns, redneck, hillbilly blood. Meet David French, get married, move to New York through the vicissitudes of life. At one point, David French's name is offered as a potential presidential candidate. I'm dealing with abuse. I'm investigating things. I mean, literally the number of things that happen in this book we adopt. It's
Yeah. It's
baffling.
nutty. And
It's
you
nutty.
you somehow touch on every major theme of American life in a funny, tragic, surprising set of stories. So it is
Right.
remarkable in that regard. Yeah.
Right. I'm like an ideological Forrest Gump because
Yeah.
I've been everywhere and I've seen everything, and I've seen how these policies or ideas have flourished or died or been perverted or been ignored or whatever, been used as a tool. So I think that's one of the fun parts of my story. I think a lot of people feel spiritually homeless, politically, culturally
Yeah.
homeless, but my stories are so dramatic. It's fun to tell them, tell the stories and then illustrate the points. But through the vicissitudes of life, and there have been quite a few, I am so thankful because as I looked back, I could see the thread
Mm.
of the narrative thread in my life, like you were mentioning that I sometimes see with my ghosted clients. And I could see that God was directing my path. We know in the Bible that it says that he does direct the steps of a righteous person. And I'm a person. And so
And you're
God's been,
righteous, Nancy.
I try. Some of the stories that I tell in the story do not, in the book, do not reflect my righteousness as much as I would love to have that righteousness.
Well, not all of
However,
us have ever lied to a presidential candidate the way you did, and you admit that you did in the story. So,
yeah, I
but
lied to Mitt
nevertheless,
Romney.
you
Yeah, I lied to Mitt Romney, and he almost died because of it, and me too. So anyway,
read the story.
but he forgave me and endorsed the book apparently. But anyway, so I just think it's fun to look at my life and all of
Yeah.
the trauma of it. It's not. I don't think it's an incredibly dark book, even though there's darkness in it.
Yeah.
I think it's ultimately hopeful because God is in control of our stories, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And so I just feel so hopeful, even though I feel rejected by the church, betrayed by the church, overlooked by the church. Um, I feel hope because God is so good. And I feel like God is so trustworthy that you can trust him when you can't trust the church sometimes. And that's where I am. I'm just, I feel like I'm holding on to God with a vice grip and to Christianity just generally and culturally with my fingernails. But I think that might be a good place to be. It might be a sacred place to be. And I think a lot of people out there feel the same way.
Holding on to God with a vice grip, holding on to the church and Christian culture with the fingernails. I love that summation. I think that describes a lot of us. To see, there's also then politics. You and I have co-written a book called The After Party that is practically trying to move Christians toward a better Christian politics. So the After Party book maybe is the hoped for remedy, or at least help, balm, band-aid, something. We're trying to respond to the problem. We don't claim it is a panacea by any means, but it's a responding to the. But your book, your story of the Ghosted, the memoir, is in some ways like a perfect setup to the After Party. I mean, I think it's lovely that these two books are coming out at the same time, because I think Ghosted makes the case for why we need the After Party. At least that's how I read it. But I'd like to hear how you connect the dots between these two books.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that because, so my book comes out 1 week prior to the After Party book. And there's already chatter online about it, Curtis. I just read an article this morning about how Ghosted precedes the After Party and how the qualities of Ghosted that, that sort of are manifest in the After Party. So I think that the After Party is so beautiful because it allows you to think soberly about the relationships and the people that you've lost, and gives you courage to approach them in a humble way, in a Christ-like way, and mend those relationships. And I feel like that's in Ghosted, that theme is definitely present. But also in Ghosted, you can see it's sort of like a description of the problem, and then the
That's
After
right.
Party is the prescription to the problem.
Yeah.
So I'm just very thankful to have both of them. It's a 1-2 punch for the problems that ail us.
Well, I am honored to have co-written the After Party with you, and I do think because in the After Party, we are so much taking a relational uh, approach to healing our political divides, rather than saying we have to all agree on some what of politics, on some substance of what's, which we never will. How can we agree on the how? How can we agree on how to approach each other? And your memoir, Ghosted, I think just depicts all of the relational complexities and the humanness of all parties, the deep, deep humanness of all parties, that makes relationships both complicated but also fundamentally meaningful, like the deep meaning of our lives. And so just congratulations on that accomplishment, on this 1-2 punch, that I at least get to be part of the punch number 2 with you on that, Nancy. Nancy, I also know that many of our good faith listeners heard you describe your cancer journey on the last podcast we did today, and I know many of them are wondering what's up, what's happening, how can they pray for you? Can you give people an update?
Yes. So I may have mentioned in the last time I was here that I have to do this thing called the Red Devil chemo, which is the most brutal chemo get a new name, right? Right. Why call
Yes.
it that? They
Yeah.
call it that because it's red and they have to manually like insert it into your port or something. I don't know. It's so intimidating. But he who is in me is greater than he who is in the red devil, Curtis. And I've
Yes.
had
Amen.
I've had 2 infusions. I've got 2 more. So I'm in the middle of that. I'm so thankful. It is HE double hockey sticks and horrible, but I'm so thankful because I feel alive and vibrant, and I'm dealing with it. I think maybe a little better than I anticipated. I was full of trepidation about it. I have not walked into this cancer journey with incredible faith and faith that moves mountains and all that. I just feel like I've woken up and gone to the appointments and come home. So I'm very thankful to have gone through half of the Red Devil chemo treatments, and I've got 2 more to go, and then surgery and radiation. So everything stinks. However, thank you so much for praying. I love you guys so much. The online community of support has been devastatingly encouraging. I love you guys so much. And the biggest apprehensions that I have, if anybody would like to pray for this, is that I've been a ghostwriter for 1 million years, and I've always wanted to have my own book. And I have to trust that it's God's timing that I have the book launch on April 16th and the Devil chemo on April 17th, which means that I'll be completely face planted in a mattress when my book is launched. And so I'll have to wait to hear all of your praise and criticisms until after I'm, like not completely puking my guts out. So if you could just pray that all of that is okay, or maybe this, I don't know. Like, I don't necessarily think the symptoms will be eradicated for the third Red Devil. It gets progressively worse. So I don't know, just buy the book and then hold all of your applause slash hatred for about 7 to 10 days afterwards so that I could deal with it then.
Well, please do that. Please, we'll put a link in the show notes to how you can buy the book Ghosted, which I highly recommend and encourage everyone to do if you are care at all about the American story. It will be an experience I think also will be like what Jody and I experienced, which is a combination of being a page turner and a poignant exploration of these themes with powerful insights. So, Nancy, thank you for giving that book to the world, to the church. Um, Nancy, I also want to maybe let's end here then by asking you, what's next? I mean, and I know this question is a um, difficult or loaded question for anybody with your cancer diagnosis because you don't know what's next. But on the same time, none of us knows what's next. We are all terminal. We are all have limited time spans. So I think it's appropriate for you to share. Well, as far as you know, as far as you can see or hope, what's next for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. No, so I've been doing stories for other people for a long time. So this is the first. I've wanted to stop ghostwriting and start focusing on my own story now that I have the courage to tell it. And so I'm very thankful to have done that. Having said that, I don't really necessarily have much more to say about my own life. It's pretty much in there, Curtis. And so I really enjoyed investigations. And so I'd love to go back to investigative work. And I've also enjoyed painting and doing art. I picked that up over COVID, and I just enjoy that. I find it very peaceful. I will even, during chemo, I'll go up to my little studio, which is Austin's old bedroom, my son's old bedroom. And I'll stay for 10 hours. Like, I will not get up. I love to paint. I love to create. And so I'm not sure what comes next. Probably more investigations, probably more paintings. But I'm not sure. I don't even like rule out ghostwriting because I just love that. I love the sacred connections that I make with all of my clients. But I don't know. I've got surgery. I'm just complete. It's sort of invigorating to be 49 years old and to not know what's coming next, and to be able to sort of reestablish yourself and to just do different stuff. It's very exciting. I mean, exciting in the way that you could die, but I'm choosing to look at this positively, and I'm very like hopeful for the future for whatever that brings.
Well, thank you, Nancy, for sharing that word of hope and humility, two themes of the after party that apply not just to politics, but to life. So, Nancy, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me on here. This has been so fun, and thanks for all the kind words about the book.
All right, listeners, before we go, This week's listener review comes from Femme Brulee. Femme Brulee, I love that pun. Thank you. That is awesome. So Femme Brulee writes, quote, "Finally, there is a place to get a biblical perspective on issues without getting caught up in partisanship. I appreciate hearing from different viewpoints. I also appreciate that it helps me be able to speak to others with Bible-based comments and thoughts. I found this podcast recently after reading The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory by Tim Alberta, and I'm listening to both the current podcast as well as starting back at the beginning. The topics from 2021 are still relevant and worth listening to. Thank you, Curtis, and all for your vision and dedication to the truth." Wow, Femme Brulee, thanks so much for those kind words. And thanks especially going back to the catalog. I encourage everyone to at least scroll back and see if there are some topics that you might find interesting. And just again, once again, thank you to all in the Good Faith community. I hope you all will join us again next time around the campfire.